Hello, happy Friday. I can see that I'm now live. My page is still uploading slightly, so I'm not quite sure if anybody has tuned in to watch yet. Oh no, yep, it's starting to appear. I can see we've got two people watching already. Hello, happy Friday. Thank you for being so prompt and on time. As usual, we will give it a few more moments just before we dive in. Hi, William. Lovely to see you. Nice and early as always. Great to see. Yeah, we'll give it a few more moments, let a few more people tune in because we have loads of interesting things to talk about today, if I do say so myself. Hello, Adele. Hello, Denise. Hello, Sylvia. Yes, captions. Yes, this is a new thing that Facebook's offered. We were quite bothered by the fact that we weren't offering them previously, so I'm now very glad that for those who are hard of hearing, we now offer captions so you can keep up with what's being said. We rely on Facebook for the accuracy, so apologies if sometimes they are a little bit off. Just gonna have a look. Hello, Linda. Great day. Yeah. After a very the top, yes, bottom half of the head, maybe not so much. It was great to finally get a haircut after a very, very long time. Hello, Kim. Hello, Ian. Hello, Alison. Hello, Jackie. Hello, Patricia. Hello, Nicole. Hello, Chris. I will try and stay awake. Still like 39 hours in hospital. Well, we all wish you the best, Chris, and we hope you get well very soon. And I hope you're feeling better. Oh, brilliant. Paul, glad to hear you made it back in shopping in time and no bridges off or traffic. Great to hear. Georgia, hello from hello in Canby Island. Hello, Ellen. Hello, Shirley. Hello, Karen. Hello, Lorraine. Hello, Graham. Hello, Angie. And hello, Karen again. So brilliant. We will kick off as we've got a good number of people watching and loads of interesting things to discuss. Well, happy Friday. Thank you very much for tuning in. It's good to be back after a little bit of a break. What are we talking about today? Well, in my humble opinion, we've released some genuinely fascinating records this week. A really small collection from Coventry, very niche, but they really are a truly wonderful slice of social history and a fantastic example of how unusual resources that normally you wouldn't think to look at can tell you so much more about the lives our ancestors lived, the times they lived through, and the experiences they endured. So these are a brand new collection of pawn shop tickets from Coventry. I've got a really interesting story behind them, which also highlights the invaluable work that family history societies do in preserving all aspects of our history. So we'll be taking a look at those and having a little look at the role pawn shops played in interwar Britain, how tough life generally was during that time. These tickets are a very stark reminder of how hand to mouth most people genuinely lived and how getting through the week was a struggle week in, week out. So we'll take a look at those, the amazing story behind them, how they were lost for 100 years and unearthed, and how they shed light on this. And they really do shed light on life in a city in the years immediately following the First World War. So we will take a look at those. We will also have a look at a very interesting new newspaper we've added, the Edinburgh Gazette, which marks a bit of a milestone for our newspaper collection in that it's the oldest title we have ever published, going all the way back to 1699. So we'll take a very quick look at that. But the main thing on the menu today is it's a topic I've wanted to tackle for a very long time, and it's a topic that's certainly very dear to my heart, and that is the history of the pub. And it's a huge topic because the more I was looking at it and the more I got thinking, pubs. Well, the reason I wanted to address it was obviously pubs under COVID-19 have faced some unique challenges. I went to the pub for the first time since lockdown began last week, and it was a surreal experience. Something that I've never been. Yeah, I can't really compare it with any other times to the pub. It was bizarre. So that made me think pubs. The reason so much emphasis was put on pubs shutting and them opening up isn't just the economics; it's the valuable role they play in society as meeting spaces, and that's certainly very true for our ancestors in counties, towns, villages all across the UK. Two things, regardless of their station in life, the jobs they did, their role in the community, two things would have been constants in your ancestors' lives: their parish church and their local pub. In many ways, just like the parish church, a lot of life's milestones were celebrated in and around pubs. I mean, there's a great quote around what is it? Birth, love, and death being the best reasons to get dressed up. But birth, love, and death are also the best reasons to join your family in the pub and celebrate and think about life. And it's where generations meet. It's where stories are passed down. So yeah, I wanted to have a bit of a look at the fascinating history of pubs and the role they've played throughout the ages, and also a little bit of a look at what it would have been like going to the pub at different points in history, what your ancestors would have played, what they would have drank, what they would have eaten. And yeah, I think that's going to be quite interesting. So I won't waste too much time, and we'll dive straight in. So, for those of you who are tuning in for the first time, we do these every single Friday. We do them on Tuesday as well, I believe, or Wednesdays. Anyway, we do multiple live broadcasts a week. It's an opportunity for us to talk to you directly. More importantly, it's a place where fellow family history fans can chat to each other and bond over our shared love of family history. So yeah, if you do have any questions, if you're a complete beginner, if this is the first time you're tuning in, this is a great place to get your questions answered. We have some incredibly knowledgeable people in the comments, people who watch these most weeks, and some of whom have been doing genealogy for a lot longer than I have, and have much more in-depth knowledge than I do. So yeah, if you've got any questions, if you've got any questions for me or Ellie, my colleague, who's also in the comments, do pop them down. But also, if you've just got any questions about generally getting started, great opportunity to ask them. So, in the spirit of fostering conversation, we like to also start these with a question of the week. Just something that something to get everybody thinking about their past, something that most people can hopefully answer. And the official question of the week this week is, what evidence have you found of your ancestors falling on hard times? And the reason we're asking that is because it ties in very neatly with these pawn shop records and what they show about the struggles endured in interwar Britain. But yeah, so we've had a few people send in answers already. Let's have a little look-see. So Sylvia's say, oh, and that's me looking at another thing. Well, I've lost the answers that have already come in. Let's have a little quick look and see if any have popped any in the comments. Couple of answers. Sue Moon Warner saying, I've got a couple of ancestors that were publicans. Hopefully, I'll be able to give you some tips on finding out more about them. Sylvia saying, I'm working on expanding my family tree for all the descendants of one set of great-great-grandparents. This afternoon, I found one of my distant cousins was landlord of the Flying Dutchman in Padiham, Lancashire. The report of a funeral I found will be providing strong hints for his other relatives. Henry Gadsby, also a publican ancestor. Well, when we get to the story about pubs, you'll see how many pubs there were. There were a lot more per head of the population than there are today. That stat I thought was quite fascinating. Hello, Anne in Canada. Good morning to you. Adele Philpox, yeah, finding ancestors down the workhouse. That's a very common means of knowing they definitely fell on hard times. Adele saying, we didn't know if they entered the workhouse to gain medical treatment. Could have also been that. I myself have not found any ancestors in the workhouse, but I do know that my maternal great-grandfather, my grandfather's father, worked in the copperworks in Prescott, which was quite a brutal, dangerous job with all the chemicals he was surrounded to. In fact, one of the things my grandfather always tells me is his father died when he was quite young, but one of the few things he could remember was that his father had green hair as a byproduct of constantly being surrounded by all these toxic chemicals. And I'm pretty sure, obviously I can't say for certain, but the fact that he died so young, he was probably about my age now when he died, could have been a result of those terrible working conditions. So yeah, that is. Oh, and Chris Lang saying many references in parish poor law records. Can always rely on you, Chris, for great pearls of wisdom. Overseers records. Some of my Wembury Devon families were given shoes records for this, given it in the alternate parish records. Well, if anyone else has tips like that, take Chris's lead, get them in the comments. That's a perfect example of ways you can find out whether your ancestors fell on hard times. So that's first question of the week. Second question of the week is about pubs. Do any of your local pubs have wonderful, fascinating histories? Have you researched your local pubs? Have you found out anything particularly surprising? Going back to my grandfather, where he lived on the Wirral, a little village called Williston, there's a very old pub there called Pollard's, which dates back to the 1500s. And during renovation work in the 90s, they found a Civil War, an English Civil War era cannonball wedged in the chimney stack. And they believe that was lodged there during a lot of the fighting that took place in the area. Chester, which was a big nearby city, was under siege, which is just cool, amazing to think that, you know, the pub that I was drinking a pint in had cannons fired at it in the 1600s. Similarly, my local pub in Twickenham, the White Swan, which is a beautiful pub on the banks of the River Thames, goes back to 1640. Speaking to the bar staff in there and telling them I was a history nerd and asking them what they knew, and they'd found the deeds going right back to the 1640s, which led me to do a little bit of my own digging around pubs. And after consulting a variety of different resources, mainly census records, trade directories, and various licensing records that I could find at other places online, I was able to find out quite a bit over the different proprietors over the years. The earliest I was able to find was a lady called Susanna Vernon in 1714, and part of me wondered how unusual it would have been for a woman to have been the proprietor of a pub in the very early 1700s. I don't know. So yeah, that's what we're talking about this week. And without further ado, I think I should dive in. Ellie is saving me with the question of the week responses that we got sent in earlier. Thank you, Ellie. It's always comforting to know you're watching. So this is in answer to ancestors falling on hard times. Kimberly Thompson says, quite a few of my East London born ancestors fell on hard times, or rather born in them. That's another, not always falling on hard times. Many ancestors were simply born into them and are stuck in that never-ending cycle from generation to generation. I found lots of helpful information by searching poor law records, workhouses, and also looking at newspapers, echoing exactly what Chris said, totally true. Tracy Bedford has said, my 3 times great-grandmother, Maria Sutherland, born in 1828, put herself and her 4 daughters, Agnes, my 2 times great-grandmother, Anne Maria, Rachel, and Elizabeth in Norwich Workhouse between the years 1870 and 1875. The records for going in were destroyed years ago, so don't know why they ended up in there. But daughters hit 14, they were let go to work as domestic servants. Maria eventually leaving in 1875. And your comment, Tracy, thank you very much for sending that in, about the records being destroyed, leads me on very nicely to this week's record. Maz Todd, just seen your comment, you beat me to it. Maz says, I used to live in Nottingham, where the ye old trip to Jerusalem is claimed to be the oldest pub in England. It also has the Ball Inn, which is pretty ancient. I will be talking about ye old trip to Jerusalem and the fascinating history behind that in a little bit. Great. It seems like a pub history. I mean, to be honest, I think you could film a whole documentary series on the wonderful history of British pubs. But I'm going to do my best to summarise it in about 20 minutes. So we'll see how we get on. Right, yeah, I really should crack on with records. So Friday, you know the score. Every Friday, brand new records. And what have we added this week? Well, I will save the best till last. First up, in my opinion, these are the Coventry pawn tickets. But first up, we've got a brand new collection from the US. So anyone watching in the US with ancestors in Idaho will find this interesting. This is the United States Idaho reconstructed 1890 census. So the actual 1890 US census was tragically destroyed by fire. This is going to be a common theme in what we're talking about. This is a substitute index, which will help you plug those gaps. So very, very, very valuable if you have ancestors in there around that time, because of course the full national census went up in smoke. So this is a reconstructed version of it, and should hopefully help you fill those gaps. Also, we have Warwickshire Burials. These come courtesy of the Coventry Family History Society, who also provided us with the pawn shop tickets. And we'll be talking a little bit more about them in a couple of minutes. But Warwickshire Burials, we've added over 140,000 additional records from 3 cemeteries, which is London Road Cemetery, St Paul's Cemetery, and Walsgrave Cemetery. And if you want to see all the cemeteries that are covered in this big collection of about 2 million records, check our parish list. Every baptism, marriage, and burial collection we have on the site will have one. It will list every single parish covered by that collection, along with the date ranges specifically covered by that parish. Always recommend checking those if you're having a look in parish records, because it's just the best way of knowing whether you're barking up the wrong tree or not. Always give those a look. So very quickly, before we get on to Warwickshire Coventry pawnbroker tickets, we will take a look at newspapers. So we've added loads of different newspapers. I'm not going to read through them all. I'm only going to take a look at what I think is the most interesting one, which is, oh, hello, Audrey. Lovely to see you. Hey. Hi, Audrey. Audrey said 3 of my great-grandmothers applied for poor relief, and the other one was one of several dependent children listed when her pregnant mother was abandoned by her husband. Makes you realise how fortunate we are to live in times where there is at least some form of safety net. If you fell on hard times, if it was the workhouse or the streets, I guess, for most of our history. So another reason to be thankful. Anyway, the Edinburgh Gazette, now available to search on Findmypast and the British Newspaper Archive, is a big milestone for us, as I said earlier, because it brings our newspaper holdings back into another century, from the 18th to the 17th. So our oldest newspaper now begins in 1699. So when the Edinburgh Gazette was first published, late 17th century, newspaper production was still very, very, very much in its infancy. It was still a blossoming form of communication. The early 1600s marked they were turbulent times, to say the least. I think that's fair to say. You know, you had the civil wars in the 1640s, but the early 1600s were marked by heavy, heavy government censorship. But after the Civil War, the demand for news grew exponentially, and out of this was born the London Gazette, which was first printed on November 1665, originally known as the Oxford Gazette, just to make things a little bit more confusing. And the London Gazette was essentially, it was government produced, and the Edinburgh Gazette was a carbon copy. It was produced 34 years after the London Gazette was first published, and it was published by, this is the Edinburgh Gazette we're talking about now, sorry, it was published by Her Majesty's Stationery Office. And one thing that's quite interesting about this was it was published by Her Majesty's Stationery Office as a Scottish newspaper, but this was 8 years before the Act of Union. Its content generally consisted of legal and official announcements from His Majesty's government, also from the Scottish Executive, Parliaments at Westminster, Holyrood, armed forces, local authorities, churches, companies, private citizens, all sorts. What you'd expect in an 18th century newspaper, really. So you'll find things, articles on state matters, parliamentary affairs, planning, even transport. Things like the closures of local footpaths or toll roads or roads would be announced, as well would regular notices of bankruptcies, appointments of key officers, liquidators, meetings of creditors, all those kind of things. But yeah, it was published by Her Majesty's Station Office. The guy who printed it was actually quite interesting. Publication began on the 2nd of March in 1699 by a chap called James Watson the Younger, son of James Watson the Senior. Both Watson Senior and Younger were renowned Scottish printers, booksellers, and Watson the Younger actually founded quite a number of Scottish newspapers. They were a long line of printers, basically. But Watson the Younger is quite an interesting guy. He was not afraid of controversy, and his printing often found him in court. And he was actually sent to prison at least once for his printing. He only printed 41 issues, leaving up until 17th of July 1699, when he had a big old bust out with the editor, a man with the fantastic name of Captain Donaldson, which forced him out. And Donaldson said afterwards that Watson found it in his interest to disengage himself. Which basically means it was getting a bit too dangerous for him to stick around doing this paper, because he, as I said, he'd got in a little bit of trouble. I think what Donaldson was alluding here to was the preceding June, Watson had actually been locked up for printing fake news. Fake news was a thing in the 1600s. It's not a modern phenomena. History is a cycle. Things repeat. There's nothing new under the sun. So basically, he printed fake news on the wool export and reported of some riotous behaviour of textile workers in Edinburgh, and this got him in a lot of trouble. He was imprisoned, so then eventually he decided, I think I should step away from this paper, too many eyes on me, and the publication was handed to a chap called John Reed. So yeah, it was published twice weekly, up until, and then intermittently after the years 1699, and then its final issue appeared in 1793. So welcome to the Edinburgh Gazette. We're thrilled to have it on the site, and I think we do have more issues coming further down the line. I think there's plans to actually release a collection similar on Findmypast as a dedicated record collection. So there you go. Quick look at some of the comments. Just to see people helping each other out, always lovely to see. Chris Langford, lots of my husband's ancestors had pubs, beer houses at various times over the centuries. My father-in-law also ran some of these pubs many years ago. It seems to be incredibly common. Do you know who else had landlord ancestors? Kate Winslet. Kate Winslet is descended from 5 generations of Reading landlords, and they were still running pubs in Reading, I think, up until the 80s or 90s. I think there's a blog about it on Findmypast if you want to find out more. So yeah, all of you with publican ancestors are in good company. Kate Winslet, who is a fantastic actress. Right, so now it's time to look at these incredible Coventry pawn shop tickets. So, what are they? Well, they are precisely what you'd imagine. They were tickets made by 3 Coventry pawn shops operating in the city centre between 1915 and 1920. Let me make sure I don't get the date wrong. 1923. And they're just such a unique, unusual little slice of history. They tell you things like who was pawning an item, how much they were pawning it for, their address, so you can see where they were living, a description of the item, how much they received, and whether they got it back or not. So they cover pawn shops made at 1 to 2 Silver Street, 118 Gosford Street, and Phillips Electric Arc Welding Limited. These are all run by one family, the Brooks family. And these records were thankfully salvaged by the very hard-working volunteers at the Coventry Family History Society. The story behind them I do think is wonderful. So they were lost for 100 years. No one knew they existed. No one had even thought to look for them. And basically what happened was the Coventry Family History Society were manning their stand at the Coventry Heritage Weekend, and a builder turned up. This builder had recently been doing demolition work at 118th Gosford Street, and while demolishing the building had found this box of incredibly dusty, damaged, filthy, dirty old cards. So damaged and dirty that even the Family History Society didn't know what they were looking at first. So they cleaned them up a little bit, and to their great surprise and joy, they realised that these were the original tickets made by the pawn shops and given to customers. And they undertook a pretty substantial transcription project. Originally, the tickets that came from the Gosford Street address only numbered in the several hundred. But when word got out, someone else got in touch and was like, "Oh, I think I've got some more of these. I've got them in my attic." So the Family History Society members went over to have a look, and what they found were, I think, how many boxes was it? It was many boxes. They found 8 cucumber boxes packed several layers deep with tickets. So thousands of them, and they worked up 2 years it took them to clean these up. They had to wear masks because of the dust and the mold and the dirt, aprons, old clothes, they had to use garden sieves to shake off the dust, which gives you an idea of the really terrible condition these were in. But they were able to salvage several thousand of them. And what they reveal about life in Coventry during this era is fascinating. So just to set the scene, interwar unemployment and poverty was a serious issue in Britain during those times. Between the end of the First World War and the start of the Second World War, unemployment was very much the dominant issue of British society. It was talked about constantly. It drove most government policy. It was a big deal. I mean, unemployment levels rarely dipped below 1 million, but did reach a peak of about 3 million in 1933, which represents more than 20% of the working population. I mean, we're worried about unemployment now, but that really does put things into perspective, doesn't it? And there were several reasons for this, really. Decline in industry after the First World War. The end of the war did bring a bit of a boom, particularly if you think of the shipping industry. Business expanded rapidly in order to take advantage of the increasing demand, but this boom was very, very short-lived. And the rapid expansion caused a slump from oversupply, and then general structural weaknesses in the British economy meant a disproportionate number of jobs were in very traditional industries like shipping. So a combination of a lack of pre-war technological development, and then post-war competition just ravaged the British economy, and new industries emerged, but they employed far fewer people. And Britain was also starting to lose her overseas markets at that time due to strong foreign competition, and it all made a just a terrible combination of really, really, really hard times. I mean, Billy Bragg sums it up very well in his song "Between the Wars." What's the opening lines? It's I was a miner, I was a docker, I was a railwayman between the wars. I raised a family in times of austerity, with sweat at the foundry beneath the wars. Um, so yeah, very, very, very hard times, and that's what's reflected in these tickets. So let's have a little look at what they reveal. So, who were the customers? So, Gosford Street, where the premises at 118 Gosford Street was a very poor area, full of court dwellings. Yeah, generally very, very poor people in those areas. Silver Street, where the other premises was based, also had some very poor slum areas around it. Um, but that being said, the items pawned at the Silver Street shop had a slightly greater value. Men usually pawned things like watches, jewelry, boots, suits, tools. And at this shop, there were some payments of 20 shillings and around 25 shillings over, usually for watches. But I think one of the more unusual ones was a 20 shilling ticket for a jacket and costume, which must have been very good quality to being given that value in 1918. However, when you look at the Gosford Street store, which served a much poorer community than the Silver Street one, you realise how little these people genuinely had. They had nothing. We didn't find a single item above the value of 10 shillings being pawned in that shop. And the other thing that was quite interesting to notice as well was that virtually all the customers were women. And many of them would be using it so frequently, they'd be going in on pretty much a weekly basis. They'd pawn items on a Monday, probably to help them get them through the week, and then they'd retrieve them on Friday and Saturday when their husbands got paid, only to return them on the Monday and repeat the process. It's also, you also wonder whether they got them back on a Friday to ensure they look good for church or maybe an evening down the pub. Who knows? On some days, you see large amounts of tickets being issued, well into the hundreds. Most were on a Monday morning. Mondays were always the busiest day because of this pattern of pawning your items on a Monday, collecting them on payday, and then returning them the following Monday. And to give you an idea of how heavily this one store, so this is not one, the Gosford Street store alone was issuing approximately 2,500 tickets a month, which is a lot. And we can actually identify who some of the most frequent users were. So there was a lady called Elizabeth Clements of Much Park Street, a lady called Susan Britton, also of Much Park Street, Anne Patterson of Threef Street, Esther Ball of Whitefriars Street. And actually, Elizabeth Clements and Anne Patterson came into the shop so often that the folks at the Family History Society have actually wondered whether they were agents who were working for the women in their community. I imagine there would have been a certain degree of shame in pawning items. Maybe I'm wrong, but perhaps these women were making a little bit more money by representing the women in their community, maybe shouldering some of the shame, or maybe they were better at pawning items and knew how to get the best money. Who knows? Silver Street premises, there were also frequent users. A lady called Polly Brown of Swan Street, Alan Parsons of the new buildings. But some people did use both shops. They didn't stick to their specific shops. One of the things that really made me sad, though, was, as I said, these span the years of the First World War from 1915 to 1918 and then into the 1920s. But it was quite poignant to see how incredibly busy the shop was on the Christmas Eve of 1915. That was an incredibly busy day, and this is probably because women's husbands were away fighting the war and money was desperately needed to provide for the family's Christmas. I mean, a follow-up project that I'd be quite interested to do would be to have a look at the women who were frequently using the shop in the years after the war and work out how many of these women were war widows. I imagine quite a number of them. But yeah, it's just a stark reminder of how difficult life was for the average person during this period of history. And I just think these records are a fantastic slice of life, and yeah, just a completely rare, unique, unusual historical gem that can, on the surface, doesn't look like much, but when you delve deeper, it can reveal all sorts. I mean, it shows what people valued. I mean, what the items that were pawned. So things that were very frequently things like bed linen, shoes, dresses, coats, jackets, tablecloths, even underwear, bras and knickers were very, very frequently pawned, which is a stark reminder of the extreme poverty some of these people faced. I mean, if you're pawning your underwear, times have to be tough. But it also shows what these people valued and what were the most valuable items in their possessions. Um, so yeah, that is it. I do there even if you don't have Coventry ancestors, they're a wonderful little slice of history. So do check them out. Before we dive into the fascinating history of the Great British Pub, I'm going to have a little quick look at some of the comments. Alison Williams, my great grandfather was landlord of the Lamb in Romford. Found him in a newspaper article on FMP of him being summoned for selling wine as port. Naughty boy. He was found not guilty, but the wholesalers were found guilty of supplying it. Jackie Mackenzie said, one of my ancestors on the census had his trade as a taverner. Is that to do with pubs? If so, how can I find out what pub? That was up in Scotland. Ooh, I imagine that would be, yeah. I think one of your best bets are trade directories. So there are, do you know what? I'll leave that bit towards the end of the video. We'll have a quick look at some of the resources you can use to track down publican ancestors. But really, your best bets, generally speaking, are censuses, which you've already looked at, trade directories, general online reading about local history, and there are various online resources for things like licensees, bar staff, lodges, visitors, those kinds of things. But hopefully we'll have a look at them at the end. Let's have another look at what folks are saying. Lynn Little saying Michael Wilson, born 1833, St Giles in the Field, ended up in the workhouse. Tragic. Audrey Collins, when I worked at the Family Records Centre, I used to pass a pub called the Castle in Turnmill Street. The only pub in England to have a pawnbroker's license. Oh wow! It still displays that's a wonderful marriage of the two topics. It still displays the pawnbroker's three brass ball symbols. These days, I think they require hard cash or plastic for a drink. It's brilliant. Thank you, Audrey. Right, so on to the wonderful storied history of the British pub. Right. I'm just getting my notes up because it's such a long and interesting history. I wasn't able to memorize it all, but we will have a look. So I think it's fair to say. So if you're just tuning in, just a quick summary. If you're just tuning in, question of the week, let us know about any evidence you found of your ancestors falling on hard times. Also, let us know if your ancestors ran pubs or worked in pubs, or if you've done any research into your local pub and found anything surprising or unusual. We've just talked about the new records we've added this week, including a very old newspaper and some Coventry pawnbroker tickets. And now, in the remaining half an hour, we're going to be looking at the wonderful history of the Great British Pub. Chris Lang, Chris, you're a star. Newspaper reports for licenses issued. There you go. Many local archives also hold records for licenses issued. Perfect. I don't think I'm even going to need to do my records tip at the end now. Chris got it covered. Thank you, Chris. Honestly, really always appreciate it. Oh, Jackie Mackenzie says, my great-grandfather and great-grandmother ended up in prison for neglect of the children. Reading the newspaper articles seemed like work was hard to come by. So sad they couldn't afford a stick of furniture. Tough times indeed. Pubs, right, back to pubs. So I think renowned the world over, British and Irish pubs are cornerstones of the national cultures. I do think that's fair to say. And I think it's definitely true that the British pub is not just a place to drink beer, wine, cider, or even something stronger, if that's what you're into. It's a unique social centre. Really, it really is very often the focus of community life in villages, towns, cities, literally in every corner of the British Isles. It's so important to this day, in fact, that recent statistics have suggested that almost 1 in 4 Britons will meet their future wife or husband in a pub. And I'm sure many of you watching will probably say, that's actually where I met my partner. I did as well. I met my now wife in a pub in Liverpool when we were both students in our first year. So yeah, I love that stat. So even today, almost 1 in 4 Britons will apparently meet their future partner in a pub. But where did it all start? Well, as with many things in Britain, it all goes back to the Romans. So we're calling it the Great British Pub. We should probably call it the Great Roman Wine Bar, because it dates back about 2,000 years. So when the Romans invaded, they brought with them roads, towns, but also their pubs, which they called tabernes. Tabernes to these shores. The tabernae arrived on British shores around 43 AD. And they weren't really pubs in the sense that we think of them as today. They sold wine, generally, and they were quickly built, dotted alongside Roman roads and in towns to help quench the thirst of all those thirsty legionaries that were marching north to attempt and fail to subjugate the Scots. It was ale, however, which was the native brew, not wine, and it appears that over time these Roman tabernets started adapting to the local appetites and serving ale to the locals' favourite tipple. And the word tabernet was eventually corrupted into tavern. So even the word tavern goes all the way back to those Romans. See, people are agreeing already. Anne McSheffy met my husband over 40 years ago in our local legion. Oh, I love a British legion. Fantastic. Um, so started with the Romans, but of course, over time, the clientele changed rapidly. Over the centuries, British pubs have served the invading Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes. Don't forget the scary old Vikings. They probably enjoyed a couple of horns of ale in some British roadside taverns. After the departure of the Romans in the 5th century, it was and then all the Romano-British kingdoms fell. It was the Saxons who really established the ale houses. And they reckon that Anglo-Saxon ale houses probably grew out of domestic dwellings, but they quickly evolved into meeting houses, very important meeting houses for folk to socially congregate, gossip, arrange mutual help within their communities, and also discuss law. And rulings and things like that. And actually, pubs were centres of local justice, going up to I think it's fair to say, to the 19th century, and we'll look at that further down the timeline. But anyway, let's get past the Saxons, because it's not what you're here for. But to give you an idea of how important pub ale houses became to Saxons, um, Ethelred, when the Code of Ethelred was introduced, there was also the wantage law, which prescribed fines for breaching the peace at meetings held in pubs. So even during the reign of King Ethelred, bouncers effectively were issuing fines and penalties for getting a bit scrappy in the pub. And in 970 AD, one Anglo-Saxon king, Edgar, even attempted to limit the number of ale houses in any one village. They were so popular, he thought there were too many. He's also actually believed to be responsible for introducing drinking measures known as the peg, as a means of controlling the amount of alcohol an individual could consume. So even people might complain about licensing laws now, like, oh, the smoking ban licensing laws can't serve, da da da. Even the Saxons were very tightly controlling pubs and behaviours in pubs. But this idea of a peg as a way of controlling the amount of alcohol an individual consumes actually is what led to the expression to take someone down a peg. See, all these weird little aspects have origins deep within history. I love stuff like this. So now we get to the Middle Ages, and travellers in the early Middle Ages could, travelling long distances, roads were terrible. It would take a long way of time to get from A to B. But many travellers in the early Middle Ages could obtain overnight accommodation from monasteries. But over time, as pilgrimages became much more popular, and there were more pilgrimages on the road, demand for hostelries grew. And the Hostelers of London were actually granted guild status in 1446, and in 1514 the guild became the Worshipful Company of Innholders. So yeah, during this time, this is when taverns and ale houses were starting to provide food and drink to their guests, while inns would offer accommodation for the weary travellers, those tired on the road. These could include things like merchants, court officials travelling between different villages to mete out justice, or, as famously immortalised by Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, pilgrims. There were thousands of pilgrims on British roads travelling to religious signs dotted all over the country, and many of them would stop at pubs and inns for respite. I mean, famous London inns can include ones like the George in Southwark and the Tabard. But today, really, there isn't any formal distinction between inns and other kinds of establishments. Many pubs actually use inn in their name either because they once were a coaching inn or because they want to summon up that image of merry old England, tri-corner caps, horses down the country road, those kind of things. Um, but as someone hinted before, inns also at times served important military purposes. Apparently, the oldest pub in Britain, this is debated though, but many agree it is, Ye Old Trip to Jerusalem in Nottingham, which is apparently dates back to 1189 AD, is said to have acted as the recruitment centre for volunteers looking to join Richard III on his crusades to the Holy Lands. But the birth of the British pub probably really started around the reign of Henry VIII, I think. Henry VII, sorry. Ale houses, inns, taverns collectively became known as public houses and simply pubs during the reign of Henry VII. And a little later, in 1552, an act was passed, and that was the act that required all innkeepers to have a license in order to run their pub. So licensing laws go back to the 1552. And to give you an idea of how many pubs there were and how popular they were, in 1577, they did a survey and they estimated there was some 17,000 alehouses, 2,000 inns, and 400 taverns dotted throughout England and Wales. And when you take into account the population of the period, that basically means there would be one pub for every 200 people. But today, that ratio would be one pub for every 1,000 people. So they had far more pubs per head back in the day than they do now. So next kind of thing in the story of the pub would be the age of the stagecoach. So the age of the stagecoach kind of brought in another new era for pubs. Coaching inns were now established on strategic routes up and down the country, and these inns, you can recognise them today. They've often got the kind of, I don't know what you call it, the entrance where the carriages would go. You know what I mean. You can recognise them. And these inns would provide drink and accommodation for passengers and crew alike, as well as stabling for the horses and sometimes even changes of fresh horses. And the passengers of stagecoaches would be considered into two distinct groups. You'd have the affluent indoor travellers who'd be sitting inside the coach, and you'd have the less well-to-do who'd be clinging to the outside of the carriage for dear life. And when arriving at these inns, the insiders would obviously receive the warmest greetings because they had the most money to spend, and they'd normally be welcomed into the innkeeper's private parlour or saloon, which many pubs still have today. And the outsiders normally wouldn't get much further than the inn's bar room. And you can still see this layout in pubs today. The Black Horse in Heswall, where I grew up, has that format. You've got the bar room where the outsiders would have congregated, and then you've got the private salon or the parlour where the more wealthier patrons would have enjoyed their drinks. But what were there? And actually, that carried on. Even though the age of the stagecoach was probably relatively short-lived in the grand scheme of things, the distinctions for class continued. I mean, like trains, which had first, second, third classes, pubs evolved in a similar manner. So pubs of that time, even pretty small ones, would be split into several rooms and bars in order to cater to the different classes, so they didn't have to mingle. And Miko, oh hi Miko, and Elsa, hi Elsa, lovely to see you. Miko saying, who else had ancestors who ran coaching inns or pubs? I've got two, one in Darlston and one in Ayrshire, Beath, I think that is. Perhaps we can get a list and find some sideways connections. Ancestors, that would be awesome. That sounds like a project, Miko. Love that idea. Elsa said local pubs could host all sorts of official activities, local excise offices, coroner inquests, excise offices, because they had space. Normally they'd be the largest room for gathering, and that's why a good reminder of how important newspapers are for uncovering pub history. But we'll see if we can look at that a little bit towards the end. So, swiftly moving on. So, what would our ancestors enjoy when they went to the pub? What would they drink? What would they eat? Throughout history, ale and beer have always formed a substantial staple part of the British diet because the brewing process made it a lot safer to drink than water of the times. It was not going to poison you. The native British brew of ale was originally made without hops, Ale with hops was introduced in the 14th and 15th century, and that came to be known as beer. And by the 1550s, pretty much all brewing included hops. Tea and coffee were introduced in Britain around the mid 1600s, but they were prohibitively expensive for the normal person. So they really did remain the preserve of the rich and actually famous. A lot of the, Jonathan Swift of the Scribblerian Club often congregated in coffee houses because it was a sign of their wealth and status and sophistication. Even with the introduction of coffee and tea, beer was the staple. But that changed. That changed just a few decades later. Things changed dramatically, and quite dramatically, when cheap spirits, such as brandy from France, but also the dreaded gin from Holland, hit the shelves of pubs. And gin actually had a striking impact on British society. Gin was popularised in England following the accession of William of Orange, basically because it provided an alternative to that traitorous French brandy, because of course it was a time of intense political and religious conflict with France, so you wouldn't want to be drinking France's national drink. Gin offered a patriotic alternative, and between 1689 and 1697, the British government actually passed mother's ruin, as Adele said, mother's ruin indeed. The British government actually passed loads of legislation aimed at restricting brandy imports and encouraging domestic gin production. Basically, no law licenses were required to make spirits, and literally thousands of gin shops sprang up all over England. It was cheap, so it became very, very popular with the poor, eventually leading to the gin craze. And by 1727, half of London's 15,000 drinking establishments were dedicated solely to gin, which shows you it was a complete phenomenon. This led to a lot of drunkenness and a lot of lawlessness. Of course, this is famously encapsulated by William Hogarth in his engravings of Beer Street and Gin Lane to show the difference between beer drinkers and gin drinkers. And that didn't come out of nowhere. There was political pressure involved. There was a Gin Act in 1736, and then another one in 1743, which were completely ineffective attempts to persuade people to stop drinking gin. They introduced a final one in 1751, and that proved much more successful and reduced consumption dramatically. By the early 19th century, there'd been reduction of duties. Gin houses, gin palaces began to spread from London to pretty much every town and city in Britain. And gin consumption, which had dipped in 1751, began to rise again. And alarmed at the prospect of the return of a great gin craze and all the chaos that would ensue, under a banner of reducing public drunkenness, the government attempted to counter the threat by introducing the Beer House Act of 1830. And this act introduced a new lower tier of premises, the beer house, and that led to the pub as we know it today. So at the time, beer was, certainly compared to gin, beer was viewed as pretty harmless and nutritious. Some even considered it healthy. It was unusual for young children to be given what would be described as a small beer, which would have quite a low alcohol content in it as well. And of course, because the local water was so unsafe, even the evangelical church and the temperance movement, which did not like drinking, were aware of the fact that beer was essential for many people to simply survive. And they did say, we don't approve of drinking beer, but we view it as a secondary evil. And if it accompanies a meal, that's not so bad. But yeah, this Beer House Act was basically an attempt to wean drinkers away from the evils of gin and encourage the consumption of wholesome beer. And what the Act basically did was it said any householder on payment of 2 guineas, roughly equal to about £190 today, was permitted to brew and sell beer or cider in their home. It didn't extend to spirits or fortified wines, just beer. Any beer house discovered selling those items would be shut down and the owner would be quite heavily fined. Beer houses were also actually permitted to open on Sundays. Beer was usually served in jugs or dispensed from tapped wooden barrels on the table in the corner of the room. And profits were so high, owners were able to buy the houses next door to live in, turning every room of their former home into bars and lounges for customers. And next time you go into a pub, think of some of these things we've been talking about today and see if you can recognize some of those features, because they're there to see. They really are there to see. So in the first year of the Act, 400 beer houses opened, and within 8 years, there were 46,000 across the country, which there's only one way to solve all these problems with beer and gin. Start drinking whiskey. Great advice, Miko. My problem is that I happen to be quite fond of all three. Not combining that. That's not a good idea. So yeah, I think I just love that stat. In year one, 400 beer houses. Within year eight, 46,000. I think it's fair to say Britain probably is a nation of beer drinkers. This far outnumbered the combined total of long-established taverns, pubs, inns, and hotels. The ones that had been there, like ye old Jerusalem, since the mists of further back history. Um, and this growth carried on unchecked until about 1869, when when the government had to step in and put new licensing laws in to make it harder to get a license. And the regime that all pubs operate under today was put into place. So there you go. That is the history of the pub. Um, in terms of their design and stuff, so they actually borrowed quite a lot from gin palaces and gin shops. It wasn't until the 19th century that pubs as we know them really began to appear. And the Industrial Revolution meant that many areas of the UK were completely transformed by this surge of industrial activity, really big rapid population growth, and this led, with more population, there's more demand for beer, and with more demand of beer, there's more demand for venues that serve it, and not just beer. It's, as I said, it really goes back to this place where communities could interact. That's primarily what it was about. It was places where communities could interact and bond and keep the community going. I imagine, and there aren't many better ways of bonding than over a nice beer, I don't think. So yeah, there was a huge demand for beer, but there was also quite a lot of intense competition for customers. And that led to things like borrowing things from the gin palaces. So by the mid 19th century, pubs were pretty much purpose built. Before that, they'd normally be converted from dwellings. Now they were purposely built, and they'd allow their owners to incorporate all kinds of architectural features that would make them more appealing, which would more importantly, to distinguish them from private houses and make them stand out from the competition. So this is a pub. You'd recognise it just by looking at it. And they borrowed a lot of these features from gin palaces. Things like bar counters, those came from ornate mirrors, etched glass, polished brass fittings, lavishly tiled services. These were all features that had first made their appearances in gin houses. They were borrowed from the gin houses and taken into the pubs. So actually, it's probably fair to say that the modern pub is a hybrid of the traditional beer house and the gin palace. It came together, and you put them together and you get a modern pub. So in the last few minutes, actually, before we sign off, what would have our ancestors done in the pubs? Well, they would have played games. They would have talked. They would have drank. They would have smoked. They would have eaten. But actually, let's have a quick look at pub names. So pub names. I love pub names. Many pubs, as I said, are very, very old. And that when they were originally standing, most of their customers would not have been able to read. So the pictorial signs associated with the clever names you see hanging above pubs were very important to get customers in, because they couldn't read. They couldn't read the signs, but they'd be able to see the pictures and know the pub, know what the pub was called, or work out the name and communicate it to their friends. But there are some common pub names that you can actually use to work out the history of your pub. So a really common one you've probably seen is the Marquis of Granby. There's loads of pubs called the Marquis of Granby all over the UK, and these pubs are all named after one man, a man named John Manners, the Marquis of Granby, who was the son of John Manners, the Duke of Rutland. And he was a general in the 18th century army, and he was an incredibly popular general who showed great concern for the welfare of his men. And on his retirement, he provided them all with funds, and many of to establish them in life, and many of them used these funds to build taverns that they named after him. So if you go to a pub called the Marquis of Granby, it's fair to assume that pub was founded by an ex-soldier who served under the general and used the money given to them to build their pub, and they named it in honour to their patron, who they had great affection for. Another interesting fact is every pub that was granted a licence in 1780 was called the Royal George, after King George III, to commemorate the 20th anniversary of his coronation. So if you're in a pub called the Royal George, it was probably granted its licence in 1780. And even some of the pubs that have like names that you might think are really whimsical. or just bizarre or surreal, actually come from corruptions of old slogans or phrases. So like the bag of nails, I've seen a few pubs called the bag of nails. Apparently that would be a corruption of the old saying bacchanals. I don't know what that means. Hopefully someone in the comments does. Or the goat and compass. That's one I can do. The goat and compass. That would be a corruption of the old phrase God encompasseth us. Well, I said I could. God encompasseth us. The goat and compass. You can see how it comes. The cat and fiddle, the chat and fidel, or faithful kitten in French. The bull and rush, which would the bull. If you go into a pub called the Bull and Rush, that would purportedly be celebrating the victory of Henry VIII at Boulogne-Bouche. My pronunciations are very bad. I do apologise. So yeah, pub names can reveal all sorts of fascinating things about the history of that pub. But pub games, that's another good one as well. So what would they have played? Well, many of them are still in existence. Things like darts. We all know darts, skittles, dominoes, cards, billiards, but there are more obscure ones. So one I found, which I wouldn't mind giving a go myself, was called Aunt Sally. And Aunt Sally was basically played in pub gardens and fairgrounds, and players would throw sticks or batons at the model of an old woman's head, which they call Aunt Sally, and it was usually modelled on the head of an old woman with a clay pipe in her mouth. And the object was for players to throw sticks at the head, and if you broke the pipe, you won. And it probably, so in France, the game was called Jeu de Massacre, Game of Carnage, and for good reason, because apparently in some cases, a live person, a particularly unpopular person in the local community, would be used as the as the doll that everyone would throw things at. And there's actually a theory for where this came from, which was during the Civil War, bored soldiers found a way to entertain themselves. And what they did was they got a live cockerel, quite dark, placed it on a stick, and then people would throw sticks at it. Whoever killed it won the game and took home the chicken for their supper. So that's where they think that came from. And apparently, leagues of teams still play this in Oxfordshire and some of the bordering counties. Didn't know that. And then another one is ringing the bull, which would involve swinging a bull's nose ring, which would be attached to a swing. You'd have to get it on the nose and hook, and it must stay on there to count as a successful throw. Apparently, they still play this in Ye Old Trip to Jerusalem in Nottingham. And then the other one is billiards. Billiards came to the UK in the 1930s. A chap called David Gill witnessed it being played in Belgium and thought, oh, that looks like fun. And persuaded the Jelks Company of Holloway Road in London to make a similar but not exact version, and bar billiards, as we recognise it today, was born. So yeah, that was one of the things I very quickly wanted to highlight before I go. We're going to try and keep this within the hour. Was that, as Elsa highlighted before, pubs often took on very other important functions. They're often a centre of justice. The inn or the pub was essential to the effective administration of local justice, particularly in the 18th and 19th century. So until police courts were established, in many communities, inns or pubs were the only readily available large rooms or indoor spaces where public events could take place. So obviously things like auctions or town meetings were regularly held there, but also so were petty sessions, forerunners of magistrates' courts, coroners' inquests, as Elsa said before, and these would normally be held in the upstairs or back room of the pub. Sometimes they'd have their own entrance, so magistrates or coroners wouldn't have to pass through the beery throng of patrons. But obviously the sounds and smell of alcohol and tobacco smoke would have pervaded proceedings. I just find it weird that something so serious as a coroner's inquest could happen above everybody playing Aunt Sally or drinking their beer. So yeah, pub justice was basically a nice little learner for landlords as well. They get a payment for the room and an increased custom petty and the increased custom petty sessions inquests brought with them locals, because people came to watch these things, and thirsty witnesses who would quench their curiosity and thirst at the same time. So yeah, that is the wonderful, wonderful history of the British pub. It was something I wanted to look at for ages, because I do think it's true. I think that pubs and parish churches, two of the constancies in many of our ancestors' lives, played a big role, and they still do to this day. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed that. I think actually tracing, I had another whole section on how to actually find pub ancestors, but we may look at that another week, because this seems to be a topic that lots of people relate to. So before I go, I'm going to have a quick look at the comments before I leave you to get on with your weekends. So, Miko saying the English whiskey. Miko recommending whiskey. Miko does know his whiskey. Kim saying a lot of gambling going on in Victoria pubs. Very true as well. Yeah, my great grandfather had a customer commit suicide after losing a lot of money. Wow. Karen Alcott, I like wine. That's not all that needs to be stated. Angela Hitchcock, one of my family was called one of my family's pubs was called the Robin Hood. Oh, that's a good name. Audrey said I should have been in Oxford this week, which has some lovely pubs. It does indeed, and you can even buy a black and white poster of Oxford pubs in Blackwell's art bookshop. The idea is to colour them in, so that when you've had a drink, oh, that's lovely. I've actually got a framed, nice framed picture of Liverpool's. I think it's like 21 historical Liverpool pubs. I used to live a great one in the Georgian Quarter of the city called Peter Cavanagh, which I used to live next door to. Marvellous old pub, really weird. Lots of weird things hanging from the ceilings. Miko is saying the old 13th Cheshire Astley Volunteer Rifleman Corps Inn is a good pub name. Yeah, that is. I'm trying to think if you could shorten it in any way, but I think it would be a crime to do that. Nicole talking, I was brought up in a family of publicans. Hey! And it turns out my ancestors also had pubs, so this has been a really brilliant. Well, I'm very pleased. Just like Kate Winslet, you are descended from a long line of publicans. Denise McKnight, local pub, Swan with two necks. That's a good name. My dad told me it was a corruption of the Swan with two nicks, and apparently swans with two nicks on the beaks belonged to the vintners. Oh wow, I love these things. Yeah, it's a reminder of history surrounds us daily, and all you need to do is open your eyes a little bit wider and try your best to look out for it. I mean, after I've learned a lot doing this research myself, and I'm thinking of my favourite pubs, and I'm like, oh, I can actually see what that would have been like, or the structure of where the back doorway for the coroner would have. History is everywhere. Just open your eyes and have a look. We're surrounded by it, and we're living through it as well. Audrey Collins, my mother used to work in a pub which had several choices of whiskey according to the optics behind the bar, but the landlord filled them all up with the same vat of own brand stuff in the cellar. Brilliant. Right, well, at that note, I'm glad people enjoyed it. I'm going to leave you to it. Have wonderful, wonderful weekends. Who knows? Maybe you'll even be visiting a pub. And I will see you all again very, very soon, probably minus the beard. But yeah, thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you to everyone who's commented. Sounds like an AA online meeting, doesn't it? I should look at the comments, doesn't it? Well, pubs are an important part of British life. I feel some, yeah, Nicole, I feel some research in pubs coming on. I think I do too. Actually, I'm feeling inspired to do some additional research. So on that note, I'm going to leave you to it. This has been fun. Really enjoyed it. Great to see you as always. In the words of the Beatles, it's wonderful to be here. It's certainly a thrill. You're such a lovely audience. We'd love to take you home with us. We'd love to take you home. Anyway, have a wonderful weekend, one and all, and I will see you again soon. Bye-bye. Take it easy. Stay safe and stay in touch. Bye-bye.